Welcome to this lecture in which we'll be discussing Soviet civilization. In our previous lecture, we had considered Stalin as a leader, the cult of personality that grew up around him, and the Stalinization of Soviet society. Today we want to look a little bit closer at the new society built up in the Soviet Union, which was self-consciously revolutionary and modern, which claimed to be aiming for the construction of a new Soviet man and a new Soviet woman. This lecture focuses on significant and in many ways surprising artifacts of what was said to be this new civilization. We'll examine the art forms, the official art forms, which were produced to create a utopian image of a society coming into being. We'll consider how social life was to be radically restructured. We'll consider some vivid monuments that were to display the achievements of this civilization. And we'll close by considering the view from outside as well as one dissenting view from the inside, which objected to the utopia under construction. Stalin once famously told the writer Maxim Gorky that Soviet artists had a special mission. They were to become engineers of human souls. Art was, in other words, to become a form of Taylorism, literally reforming human beings, not merely reforming, but reforming human beings to produce a new man and a new woman in a society organized now on radically new grounds. Art would have to change as well in its principles. It would no longer be the expression of individual genius, the inspiration of a remarkable individual, but rather would have emphasis placed on collectivity and collective experience, the class basis and class consciousness. One movement which sought to enshrine this in official art was known as prolet cult. We see here the predilection that the Bolsheviks shared with other movements of the day for acronyms which shoved together words to create a new kind of language of political action. Prolet cult stood for, obviously, proletarian culture, and it urged new forms of art which would be produced collectively by groups of workers or artists drawing upon a communal proletarian experience to be totally distinct from earlier bourgeois art forms, with their emphasis on a look inwards and on personal experience. Now, those of us who have worked on reports together in committees or on other collective projects can well imagine what a novel might look like produced by committee. I think there are probably good reasons why we don't read such prolet cult masterpieces as enduring landmarks of art today. There was, moreover, an officially approbated form of art which was endorsed officially and made mandatory in 1932, the doctrine of what was oddly named socialist realism. And focusing on it for a moment, on this official orthodoxy in art, can give us a good sense of the way in which ideology would in many ways fundamentally transform the entire mission of art. According to this formula of socialist realism, art should be realistic in the sense not of depicting society as it currently was, but realistic in the sense of depicting evolution in process. Socialist realist art was to depict society as it was in the process of becoming under socialism. Not the present day, but the future, which seemed nearly within reach. Art, thus, would have political purposes in motivating masses. Certain implications flowed from this new mission. Art had to be simple. It had to be easily accessible and popular so that the entire population could draw the message from it. It had to be full of unproblematic and unambiguous praise for the party, the state, and the infallible leader, Stalin. In part due to Stalin's own, often quite conservative tastes in artistic forms, art now turned away from the experimental forms, the avant-garde, playing with form that earlier had marked some Bolshevik propaganda, and now turned towards more traditional forms. And the result was quite clearly an art of a nearly astonishing banality, little collected today except as examples of the sort of kitsch achieved under political pressure. It falsified the present in the name of depicting a utopia that was soon to arrive. The penalties, the flip side of this official approbation of socialist art, socialist realism, the penalties for forbidden art or speech would also consequently be severe. The poet Osip Mandelstam, who later was sent to a prison where he died for criticizing Stalin in his verse, delivered what one might consider a decisive verdict on this. He quipped that in the Soviet Union, poetry enjoyed a status that it had nowhere else in the world, because in the Soviet Union, poetry was a matter of life and death. One could literally be condemned for poetry which didn't follow the party line. Society was also to be reinvented and restructured along the lines that the party approved of. And this was part of a larger trend towards largeness, both in the arts as well as in social and economic projects. This is a trend that is often sometimes called gigantism. Planning emphasized enormous scale, as well as mass social participation in the projects that the regime felt was emblematic of its ambitions. In society, new roles were to be crafted. Women were urged to enter factories and the professions, and indeed they did. The family was to be reconstituted along new, often collective lines. Mass nurseries were established in places of work, as well as orphanages for the many orphans of the Civil War. This would often be a very valuable source of party cadres and committed communists who would follow the party as a parent. Soviet youth were enrolled in organizations in which the state could seek to influence them away from the context of the family. Young people were enrolled in the Young Pioneers organization, where they wore the uniform of the red kerchief around their neck. Public mass exercises and mass calisthenics were propaganda events celebrated in the media, as well as having the added function of instilling a sense of collectivity on the part of the young, with an emphasis on the we rather than on the I. A new social discipline was being inculcated here as well, and it was done so through particular institutions which infiltrated throughout society as well as the workplace to steer society in the direction that the party and the regime intended. Party cells were established in workplaces and collective farms. They steered and supervised the actions as well as the political consciousness, it was hoped, of co-workers, while more ominously, informers who had infiltrated throughout society kept individual life under surveillance, keeping a watchful eye for signs of ideological straying from the party line. Propaganda campaigns also sought to present models of good communist behavior and proper ideological consciousness. One especially notorious example of such a model was that of the boy martyr Pavlik Morozov. Pavlik Morozov had been a 14-year-old committed young pioneer from the small settlement of Gerasimovka in the Urals, who was famous for denouncing his own father, his own family, for hoarding of food supplies that were properly the property of the state. His own family members stabbed him to death in revenge for an action that could very well cost their lives. This figure was celebrated in the propaganda of the Soviet Union. Statues were erected to the young Morozov. Young people were urged to follow his example in putting loyalty to the state first. The Moscow headquarters of the Young Pioneer organization were named after him. He was held up as an example of proper behavior. But this was an act that had even shocked Stalin, hardened as he was. Even though Stalin approved of the idolization of this young man, his private reaction was quite a different one. In considering Morozov, he had said, "What a little pig to have done such a thing to his own family." But the regime's needs would come first. Part of the ideological emphasis on the transformation of society also sought to enforce a militant atheism, continuing the trends we'd seen under Lenin's founding of the regime. Churches, monasteries, places of worship, and synagogues throughout the Soviet Union were destroyed. Some of these institutions were in fact turned into museums of atheism, which now became, in a strange sense, temples to unbelief. And such institutions endured into the 1970s. I recall on a visit to the Soviet Union visiting such an institution and thinking of how uniquely it expressed some of the aims of the regime. Tens of thousands of clergy were arrested and executed in the 1930s as part of a program for the fundamental change in people's beliefs and minds. In part, the party was showing just how much it held power over the past, the future, and the present day. A key element in the conviction which the cult of personality would hold, which made the figure of Stalin different from other hero figures that we might think of in Western societies, other popular figures, was the assertion of total infallibility. If the leader of such a regime made a claim, that claim could, in a self-fulfilling prophecy, be made to come true. As Hannah Arendt, a formidable analyst of such systems, put it, if the leader of a regime declared as a prophecy that unemployment would be eliminated by the regime, unemployment indeed could be eliminated by eliminating the unemployed or hiding their very existence. This is not the sort of thing that could happen in a free society. The personality cult asserted a power not just over the present and the future direction of society, but also, and this is a key part of its psychological force, over the past as well. After Stalin's repeated purges, the waves of the cleansings of society, this was not merely a measure that ended with the arrest and the execution, the disappearance of those who were considered to be enemies of the regime or enemies of the people. It went a step further still, ominous in its significance. Those who were purged were also obliterated from the historical record itself. They became non-persons who had functionally never existed, most prominently in Trotsky's case. The attempts to eliminate the works and the traces of Trotsky's historical role went so far as that some works that had criticized Trotsky were banned as well because they retained some trace of this official non-person. Some historians have suggested that sometimes the retouching or the blacking out, the inking out of faces of non-persons was a deliberately clumsy maneuver. Sometimes traces could be seen that obviously in a photograph someone had been retouched or had been airbrushed out of a photograph. Some historians have suggested that this was a psychological message. The message that was being sent was that the party had power over the historical record and that this fate was not one that could be avoided. This purging was obligatory. It was demanded that throughout libraries of the Soviet Union, works or photographs of such non-persons be purged, and it could serve as a warning to those in society, a demonstration of the power of the state. One needs to consider how such a gesture could make even the prospect of potential resistance seem truly meaningless. As has been pointed out by analysts of the regime, including such regimes, including Arthur Koestler, who we mentioned in the last lecture, it's one thing to resist, knowing that one's heroism will be entered in the historical record. Another thing to resist and to know that that action will truly be obliterated and never remembered. The regime established also monuments to itself. Its claim to its own permanence, monumentality, and modernity was demonstrated by the deliberate crafting of enormous projects. One such project was the huge industrial city of Magnitogorsk. This means literally magnet city or magnet town, magnet mountain. The metallurgical factory city of Magnitogorsk was intended to hold the world's largest plant. It was deliberately intended to surpass the American city that had functioned as its original model, that had tended to outdo Gary, Indiana. International invitations went out to engineers to help participate in this massive, heroic project of construction from 1929. In many ways, this industrial city that grew up seemingly overnight was an apt symbol for the Soviet regime itself. It was built up by two kinds of people, by ideological enthusiasts, those Stakhanovite storm workers and shock workers of industrialization and the five-year plans on the one hand, and also by forced labor and prisoners. The results, however, as historians of science and of technology have pointed out, were less than auspicious. The city soon became a monument to inefficiency. So much emphasis had been placed on the propaganda value of producing this smoke-belching industrial powerhouse that less attention had been paid to the ordinary engineering questions of an efficient production setting. There was also, moreover, one particularly tantalizing and significant symbolic project which was never built, but which somehow still attained a symbolic reality in the minds of ordinary individuals. And this was the so-called Palace of the Soviets. Stalin planned a massive ceremonial building in Moscow, which was to be rich in symbolic significance. It was to be marked by the very architectural style that Stalin liked, one that its critics, and there are many of them, have labeled wedding cake architecture. It retained certain nearly religious features in its architectural style, resembling in many ways a modern temple. The features of this project from 1931 on were soaked through with symbolic resonances and ideological messages in this planning. It was to be taller than the hitherto largest building in the world, New York's Empire State Building. It was to dwarf such other monumental structures as the Great Pyramids, or Notre Dame Cathedral, or the Eiffel Tower. It was to be, as mentioned, a wedding cake-like temple structure topped by a monstrous, huge statue. A statue of that idol, that founding genius of the Soviet Union, Lenin, who would be pointing up into the skies, showing where the bright future lay. This statue of Lenin was to be twice as big as the Statue of Liberty in New York. These competitions with American symbols were not an accident. The statue was indeed to be 25 stories tall, and the index finger that pointed towards the bright future was to be 20 feet in height. This was to be the largest building in the world, rich in symbolic significance. And it could have been built on any number of sites within Moscow itself, but one particular location was chosen, one that actually had an occupant already. And that was the spot occupied by the largest building in Moscow that dominated the cityscape, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the largest Orthodox church in the world, which was now, in a symbolically significant act recorded by the regime, dynamited to make room for the palace of the Soviets. However, it was soon discovered that the project was running into problems. The ground, it was soon clear, was a bit too unstable for the enormous mass of this projected building. Stalin, too, seemed to lose interest in a project that had earlier so occupied him. And the fate of this projected construction site was, in other ways, symbolically rich in ways that had not been intended. It remained a construction site, soon became a hangout for drunks and prostitutes, and then later was turned into a swimming pool. Today, it is once again the site of a rebuilt cathedral, tracing the trajectory of Russian history in the 20th century. There were other symbols of modernity in Moscow itself that endure today and continue to impress visitors. The Moscow Metro, the underground railway, which was opened in 1935, was a major showpiece. It was built at record speed. It rivaled other underground systems, such as those of New York, but it was built at human cost. More than 1,000 dead or wounded were included in the laborers, as it was built under the direction of Nikita Khrushchev, later to be one of the successors of Stalin. Other gigantic projects also heralded the newness, modernity, and success of Soviet civilization. The Grand Dnieper Dam was to be a gigantic hydroelectric project, once again, the world's largest. It involved foreign companies, foreign engineers, and forced labor. And it came at enormous environmental cost, as did other industrial projects of the Soviet Union. 10,000 farmers were evicted to make way for the area to be flooded to create this project. Another symbol, unintentionally, of futility was the Baltic Sea-White Sea Canal. This canal, which was intended to be an important strategic project, was built in 1931 to 1933 at record speed by prisoners and forced labor who worked with few tools, instead using muscle labor and the sweat of their brows to bring this project to fruition. It was celebrated in propaganda as an example of the humane re-education policies applied towards prisoners. But tens of thousands of them in reality died in its construction. And in the end, significantly, it turned out to be largely useless. Too shallow, built using poor materials and design, all at record speed in order to meet the demands of the plan. Indeed, the Gulag camp itself represented an important symbol of the regime, as the dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn would later argue, when he suggested that the Gulag was in some sense a microcosm of the outside larger society. It was a crucial part of the Soviet regime. The existence of the camps was not kept secret. It couldn't be. They had huge staffs of warders, guards, and officials, and the importance of their labor to the economy was clear. One particular spot in the Gulag system summed up some of the importance of this institution, and this was the Gulag capital in the far east of Magadan, where over 1 million prisoners were sent to mine gold and minerals across a huge territory of 3 million square miles, the size of Europe. For us to think of a concentration camp the size of Europe boggles the imagination. Their labor was managed in what was supposed to be a rational scientific way by the Far Northern Construction Trust, or Dalstroy. Certain artifacts of everyday life also offer us interesting perspectives on the society which was intended to be built in the Soviet Union. These included the communal apartments called kommunalkas, which crowded many families together into single apartments with shared kitchens, shared toilets and baths, and almost no privacy. In part, this was simply an expedient given the housing shortage in the Soviet Union, but it was also given an ideological twist. The notion was that living would now take place communally. Under the slogan, "Palaces for the workers," residences which earlier had housed middle-class or upper-class families were expropriated, they were subdivided, and could have over 50 people living in one apartment. In Leningrad in the 1930s, about 68% of the population lived in such kommunalka collective apartments. Another vivid symbol was that of what one might call a radio, but it was in fact a little bit different. This was the so-called punkt set. It was a kind of loudspeaker that was set up in dwellings, such apartments, in farms, factories, and in public places. It wasn't a radio in the sense that we're accustomed to because it carried a single station. It couldn't have the station altered or changed, and some of these sets couldn't even really be switched off at all. The sound simply could be turned down to the point where it was simply a small murmur, and such punkt radio sets continued into our own times in the Soviet Union as well. What sort of views did people have from the outside of the building of what was supposed to be a new civilization? Well, during and after the revolution, many sympathetic visitors, especially from the West, were caught up in the excitement of these seemingly world historical events. The American journalist John Reed, in a famous text, 10 Days That Shook the World, offered his own romantic first-person view of the revolution up close. American journalist Lincoln Steffens in 1919 stated about the Soviet Union, "I have seen the future and it works." It's been suggested by some historians that he came up with this ringing quote before he had actually visited the Soviet Union, which casts it in a very different light. International visitors were welcomed on carefully stage-managed tours, and this is part of what we might call the Potyomkin syndrome. Back in the days of Catherine the Great in the 18th century in Russia, a certain Prince Potyomkin had carefully stage-managed model estates filled with happy peasants and model agriculture to present a facade. The Soviet Union would now make this into an art form. And Lenin earlier had said, somewhat unkindly, that there always would be such useful idiots who would make propaganda unintentionally for the regime. Some journalists from the West well understood the grimmer reality behind the facade, but in order to retain their access to to the Soviet Union, not to lose their privileges as journalists, they engaged in self-censorship. One journalist was told, in a phrase that might stand as a statement for this era as a whole, that you can't say that about one particular detail that he had revealed because it's true. Not because it's false, but because it's true. Socialist realist depictions of Stalin's Soviet Union seemed especially attractive to many in the West at a time of economic crisis and the Great Depression. After a visit in 1932, the British writer George Bernard Shaw, otherwise so very critical of the reality that he saw in the West, called the Soviet Union a land of hope. British reformers Sidney and Beatrice Webb also visited on an official tour and wrote a book on Soviet communism as a new civilization. In an act of psychological projection, we might call it, sympathizers celebrated what they saw as positive changes now taking place, while discounting the disturbing impressions of their visit as mere relics of the past, shortly to be overcome, or perhaps as necessary sacrifices in achieving utopia. We recall the saying from the French Revolution of Robespierre about breaking eggs in order to make omelets, a logic that some subscribed to. Finally, a view that was somewhat different was offered by a man with an insider perspective, an engineer who experienced up close the direction in which the Bolshevik Revolution was moving. This was the Russian engineer and author Yevgeny Zamyatin, who wrote what became one of the most famous novels of utopia as nightmare, or anti-utopia or dystopia, entitled in Russian My, in English translated as We. It's not known as widely as it deserves to be in the Western world. I'd like to simply mention it here. It was written in 1920, soon appeared in many other Western languages and world languages, but only appeared in Russia itself in 1988. Written as it was in the first stages of the Bolshevik regime, before full-blown Stalinism, this novel in many ways presented in science fiction form remarkable, uncanny anticipations of later developments in the Soviet Union. It was a science fiction novel set in the 26th century and imagined a new society entitled One State. All life was ruled by daily schedules. We see here echoes of the ideology of Taylorism that we mentioned in an earlier lecture. All citizens dressed alike, wearing the same blue uniforms. All were known not by individualistic names, but rather by numbers. And all individuality was submerged in the collective. Not the I, but the we was the true reality. Society was controlled by an anonymous leader figure, shrouded in a personality cult, about whom little was known, except the fact that he was omnipresent and omnipotent. This was the so-called benefactor, who would be reelected again and again in unanimous, ritual reelections. The power of the benefactor and of his system of one state was reinforced by a caste of secret police, in many ways resembling the Cheka, omnipresent throughout society, called the Guardians. In Zamyatin's novel, a revolt of individualists is suppressed in a harsh and total way. At the end of the novel, in a triumph of abstract reason, the last vestiges of imagination, this last flaw in the making of a new man and a new woman, are to be removed from the brains of all citizens in the society through what is hailed as the great operation, which will finally bring the utopia of one state to fruition. As you can well tell, the novel doesn't end with a happy ending. It ends in failure and hopelessness. Zamyatin's message was a dark one. He seemed to suggest that very many human beings found the burden of freedom in modern times unbearable and would embrace, even enthusiastically, tyranny if it eliminated uncertainty, finding their happiness in chains. Zamyatin, in some sense, long before Hannah Arendt's writings or the writings of other later analysts of such systems, was already suggesting that in some sense the ideological utopian dictatorships of the 20th century were not only an explosion of barbarism from the past or from outside, but echoed very deeply something within people in these societies. Zamyatin was, surprisingly, allowed to leave the Soviet Union in 1931 and died in exile, feeling that his prophecies were coming true. His book is the very archetype of dystopia, of anti-utopian fiction, would later be read by George Orwell and would inform his masterpiece as well. What we'll consider in our next lecture would be another version of utopia, a despotic system that would present itself as an opposed model of the future, arguing against the Soviet civilization, the system of fascism.